to ask any questions of the researchers. We really want to share the work that we've been doing over the last number of years, but also to hear the questions and concerns raised by the HD community. So we're delighted to see so many members of the HD community here with us today, and so many colleagues that we've worked with over the years and collaborators. So many of you I know will, I'm sure, be aware of what Huntington's is, but just to remind everybody where we're coming from, Huntington's is a progressive, inherited neurodegenerative disease, which is caused by an expansion of genetic code, which results in progressive brain injury over a period of time. And this results in a triad of motor, cognitive, and emotional behavioral difficulties, which are devastating and have a massive and a significant impact on relatives and caregivers. HD also has a significant effect on family members, and one of the research areas that we'll be looking at caregiver burden and the impact of Huntington's on caregivers. It's timely, this webinar today is at the end of Huntington's Awareness Month, and it's been a very successful month. There's lots of awareness and lots of activities gone out this month, and today is the final day, and the Family Matters campaign I think finishes today as well, and we'll hear a little bit about some of those today. COVID, we can't start any seminar like this without talking about the impact of COVID. COVID has had an enormous impact on neurological communities. We know that COVID has had a significant impact in terms of care. The Neurological Alliance of Ireland and other neurological advocacy groups across Europe have identified the reduced amount of care, the cancelled appointments, and the impact on ongoing care of patients with chronic neurological injuries. We know that the mortality in chronic neurology has been very significant as a result of COVID, and COVID itself has been devastating within the neurology communities. From our point of view, from the research point of view, it's had an impact on our ability to run our projects. We haven't been able to see people in person. And from very early on, we've been trying to run our research projects online, which was a lot more complex than we thought it was going to be, actually converting the projects to an online format to protect patients and not have to bring them into the clinical environment. But that's running very smoothly now, it's working very well. We have very good data protection and lots of complex IT infrastructure in place to protect everybody and protect the data, and they're all running very well. Our enrolled clinics, unfortunately, as you'll hear, haven't been running during the pandemic because it's been very difficult to get people into hospital environments, and that's delayed the services. And certainly the number of people probably dialing in today will be waiting for their enrolled appointments. But as you'll hear, we'll be starting back very soon, and we'll be able to start running our enrolled clinics and really hopefully try and catch up. It was very unfortunate because in Beaumont Hospital, we've been running our enrolled clinics since about 2015, and we were really getting into our stride when COVID hit, and we're getting some fantastic numbers coming through. But we hope to be able to catch up very soon and be able to get everybody in who needs to be into the services. So I suppose what you'll see today is a range of talks covering a lot of different areas. I've been working with people with Huntington's disease since about 1997 in the UK, and I started off at the Royal Hospital for Neurodisability in London, which is a mid to late stage service for people with Huntington's disease. At that point, realized that's where I wanted to work and where we wanted to spend our time looking at from a clinical point of view and a research point of view to understand this disease. There was some fantastic breakthroughs this year, as you'll hear, and unfortunately some devastation news as well in terms of the impact of those clinical trials and the failure for them to get started. But hopefully over the coming years we'll have some better news, and you'll hear some of that today. So you'll hear about the cognitive work, the medical work, the work in terms of neurophysiology, and some of the behavioral work that we're doing as well. So hopefully it give us a chance to tell you what we're doing, showcase the work that we're doing, and hear what your needs are, and to ask any questions about these research projects. Some of them are very complex, and they're strange ones to hear about in terms of psychological testing or perhaps the neurophysiology, and it's a good opportunity to clarify some of those concerns that you might have. So what we might do is, Colin's just going to show you the list of people now here that's going to be presenting today, and I'll just introduce each of the speakers to you so you'll hear. And as we're doing that, you can ask any questions, but we'd encourage people to use the Q&A function that's down at the bottom of your screen. Please use that. If there's any straightforward questions that we can answer, each researcher will answer it using the Q&A function there at the end. Bear with us, we're still getting used to the technology, even a year in. I'm sure something's going to go wrong somewhere along the line, but bear with us. If it looks like it's a broader question that might be applicable to all the audience, we will hold it over for the panel discussion at the end, and we will use the question there. Unfortunately, given the space that we have at the moment and the range of people that are logging in, we can't address any specific clinical needs that people might have, or any personal medical issues that can't be addressed. If there are issues, we can address them via email later, or through Patricia at the HDAI, we can try and facilitate any questions, but it's just very difficult to do that in this current situation. So there you'll see the layout of our wonderful team of researchers today, are looking extremely professional. So you've heard from me already, so I'll get started. Next person up will be Emily Cleary, who's our researcher working and coordinator of our Enroll clinic. She will give a talk on where Enroll is at the moment and some data from our Enroll HD clinic, with a view to us starting very shortly and beginning Enroll again. Then Mairead Fallon, who's our research assistant on the HD Cognition project, will talk about where that is at the moment. A number of you are already involved in that project, and you'll hear some of the data on that and where we're going and what will be involved if you decide to come along and join us in that project. Then Colin Pilo, our PhD candidate, will talk about his PhD research. It's very exciting. Colin's our first PhD student in Huntington's disease in our research group, and so it'll be extension of some of the HD cog, but also some other work that he's also doing. We have Dr. Sarah Darcy, our neurologist, who's another PhD candidate. Who'll be talking about the medical aspects and her project in neurology in Huntington's disease. And then we'll introduce Dr. Roisin McMacken, who's postdoctoral researcher in academic neurology in Trinity, who's doing some work with Huntington's disease and motor neuron disease and in neurophysiology, EEG, and a condition, the tool known as TMS. And finally, although she probably needs no introduction to this group, is Professor Orla Hardiman, who's consultant neurologist, head of academic unit in Trinity College Dublin, and clinical lead for neurology in Ireland. Will sum up the morning and talk about some aspects of broader clinical neurology and neurology with Huntington's, and also the clinical neurology programs in Huntington's disease. So it's a very exciting morning. It'll be a mix of some videos that people have recorded in advance and some live talks. So the talks in the middle will be videos, and then Professor Hard will be a live talk at the end. But please ask any questions as you go along. So I suppose before we get started, I just want to add in a few thanks to some of our colleagues here. I want to thank Patricia Towie and the Huntington's Disease Association for all their support in our research, and but funding us and supporting us and helping us get started and really advocating for research and clinical aspects. They're a wonderful organization. We really encourage everybody to support the HDAI as much as possible. We also want to thank the Monkstown Hospital Foundation, who have funded our HD Cognition project, and without whom we wouldn't be able to get started on this. We also want to thank Professor Orla Hardiman for all her support in getting these research projects off the ground and in the clinical services for Huntington's and patients. And certainly without Orla's support and extra work in this, we wouldn't be able to be here today at all. And I also want to thank Colin Pilo for pulling all this together. Colin's done a fantastic job in the technology and organizing all of this. I definitely would not be able to do this, and we would not be sitting here in front of our screens without all of Colin's work in pulling this together. So thanks to Colin for doing that. So we will get started. We're going to begin with our first talk by Emily Cleary, who's going to talk to us about Enroll this morning. Thank you.
Hi everyone, you're very welcome to the HDAI Meet the HD Researchers webinar. My name is Emily Cleary and I'm a research assistant in the Academic Unit of Neurology, Trinity College Dublin, and the Department of Psychology, Beaumont Hospital. One of the main areas within my role is that I'm the site coordinator for the Enroll HD clinic in Beaumont Hospital. Throughout this short video, I will tell you a little bit about Enroll HD and the aims of the study in relation to Huntington's disease research, and the importance of participation within Enroll HD in contributing to international research in Huntington's disease. So what is Enroll HD? Enroll HD is a multi-site observational study, and what that means is that there are no drugs or medications involved. It is purely a study to observe and gain knowledge about how Huntington's disease, or HD, affects individuals. So we follow participants over a period of time, and this shows us how the disease progresses. The main aim of Enroll HD is that it is a platform of information to better understand how the disease works within those affected by the HD gene, the progression of the disease, and what treatments may work for HD in the future. This information is then made available to researchers and pharmaceutical companies, which aim to inform clinical trials and drug development, and also inform best clinical practice for caring for those with HD and their families. There are over 25,000 participants in over 180 clinical sites in 20 participating countries around the world. And there is one site currently here in Beaumont Hospital where we currently have 67 participants completing annual visits, and they've completed about 150 visits since 2015. Unfortunately, over the past year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the study recruitment and visits have been paused. However, we do envision that the Enroll HD clinic will resume in the coming weeks as restrictions ease, and we will be able to continue carrying out these visits and recruitment. At the moment, we do have a wait list, and though there might be a long wait time due to the backlog associated with the pandemic, if you are interested in participating in Enroll HD, you will be contacted by a member of the Enroll HD team who can provide further information for you. So thinking about who can take part in Enroll, I suppose the great thing about this study is that it welcomes anyone who is a member of a family who is affected by HD. So whether you are at risk or symptomatic with HD, whether you've tested negative for the gene or have never had the gene test, you can still participate. Enroll HD not only involves individuals with the gene, but also those who don't have the gene, such as spouses or partners of family members with HD. So ultimately, Enroll HD will be looking for those who have the gene with symptoms, who have the gene and don't have symptoms, and then who don't have the gene at all. So in that sense, Enroll HD is a very accessible study, and everyone who is affected by HD can contribute in some way to overcoming this disease. So you might be thinking, why should I get involved in this research? Everyone from a family affected by HD and their carers can do so much for HD by becoming a part of this registry that provides data for researchers and clinical companies, pharmaceutical companies, to inform clinical trials and therapies for the disease. Participation is vital to the overall success of Enroll HD, and we understand that it can be a little bit scary and daunting to participate in something like Enroll. But the participation is the most important part, as without this, we won't be able to succeed and deliver the information that is necessary to inform these clinical trials. One important part that we like to inform our patients and those who are interested in getting involved in Enroll HD is that this research is completely confidential. Each participant that gets involved in the research will be given a unique code, which is a de-identified code that is used throughout the participation within Enroll. We understand that this can be quite a sensitive, concerning part of Huntington's disease. So by using this de-identified code, there is no way that your information could be exposed. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the Enroll HD clinic and how it works. When you express interest, you are added to the waitlist, and a member of the Enroll HD team will be in contact with you. You will be sent an appointment, and that letter will also have information about Enroll HD, and any questions you may have might be answered within this. The contact details of myself and the Enroll HD team will also be sent to you, and we would welcome any queries or questions you may have, as we are more than happy to answer what we can. On the day of your first appointment, a member of the Enroll HD team will meet with you at the clinic and bring you to gain your consent to be a part of the study and to complete your assessment. This is also where you can ask any questions that you may have, and we will also be happy to answer any queries you have then. You will then meet with the nurses who will draw some blood, which will be sent to a secure lab which stores blood samples. We may also talk to your caregiver or whoever has accompanied you to get their experience by filling out some forms. The assessment itself then is made up of 3 separate parts. So firstly, you will be seen by a neurologist who will work with you to do a functional and motor assessment. Next, you will be seen by a research assistant like myself, who will give you some tasks which look at your memory and thinking. These are kind of like puzzles or brain teasers that you will do with pen and paper. Finally, then, you will meet with Professor Niall Pender, who will have a general discussion about your mood and whether you've experienced or are experiencing psychological or emotional difficulties. So the Enroll HD clinic, I suppose, runs very similar to a regular outpatient clinical appointment. And the follow-up assessments are a lot quicker than the first day that you will arrive to Beaumont. And we anticipate about an hour or an hour and a half per person for the follow-up assessments. In accessing Beaumont Hospital, we do work as best we can around individuals coming in to see us. I will always try and accommodate a person with the time and day that suits them, as we know that there can be a lot of work involved in organising a trip to Beaumont Hospital. Enroll HD also covers the travel expenses of those who participate in Enroll, so they're not out of pocket by coming to the appointments. So again, just why is Enroll HD important for families and especially for Irish families? Enroll HD is an opportunity to do something positive that contributes to the future of Huntington's disease and will hopefully mean new therapies and better treatments for people with HD. By coming to the Enroll HD clinics and participating in the research, this will allow us to gather really useful information about how people in Ireland live with HD, both with the gene and without the gene. And this provides really meaningful information. It helps to determine what interventions work in order to improve the care of those affected by HD. So really what this research is looking for is all individuals with HD, their family members and siblings who are unaffected by HD to participate in Enroll. The road to effective treatments for HD requires that we understand the disease in all its complexity, and Enroll HD is the best way for families that are affected by HD to participate in this research. Everyone from a family who is affected by HD can be a part of overcoming this disease, and the most beneficial way of doing this is becoming a part of Enroll. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope you found it beneficial. If you have any questions about Enroll HD, please feel free to share them and I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. That's great. Hopefully that's a nice overview for everybody of where we're at in relation to Enroll. It's ready to go. We're hoping very soon to be bringing back everybody. We've been calling all the patients who were due their follow-up reviews, doing telephone consultation with everybody. But obviously for those reasons outlined, particularly in relation to COVID, we haven't been able to bring people in. So hopefully very shortly we'll be reigniting the Enroll clinic, which will be very exciting for all of us because we're very keen to get back again. So thanks, Emily. We can address any questions people might have in relation to the Enroll protocol or procedures or the benefits of it in the panel discussion at the end. So we're going to move on. Our next speaker is Mairead Fallon, who's going to talk us through the HD cognition study, which is taking some of the work that's already gone on in Enroll and expanding it into a broader study looking at aspects of cognition. And we're also working with colleagues in Edinburgh with Professor Sharon Abrahams on validating the Edinburgh Cognitive Assessment Scale for Huntington's disease, and that's going to be something that's part of the HD cognition study. So we'll hand you over to Mairead, who's going to update you about this study.
Hi there and welcome. Mairead is my name and I'm a researcher at Beaumont Hospital, and today I'm going to talk about a research study known as HD Cog. So what this stands for is cognitive and behavioural changes in Irish Huntington's disease patients. So for most of us, we understand Huntington's disease to be a rare inherited brain condition. Some of the symptoms include movement, mood, cognitive and behavioural disturbances, which can vary widely amongst those affected. These can have a serious impact on daily living, relationships and independence. So it is really important to identify these changes earlier on in the disease in order to be able to identify individual needs and address any potential challenges that might arise. So I'm just going to share my screen now just to give you a better idea of what we're looking into and how this can help you. Okay, so one of my colleagues is going to go into a bit more detail about the Enroll study shortly. But basically, Beaumont Hospital is one of the first places to actually set up an Enroll clinic, and this is a worldwide study, so it's a fantastic service that we have here in Beaumont. And What happens here is you get a clinical assessment with a multidisciplinary team, and the HD COG research study was developed from this because some of the cognitive assessments that were created as part of the Enroll HD battery have been used, and we've kind of added on more cognitive factors and tests, such as learning and memory, social cognition. And then as part of the HD study, we also want to validate a screening measure, which has already been validated with other diseases, which I'll talk about a bit more later. But we want to validate this in the Huntington's disease group to identify cognitive dysfunction earlier on in the disease. So the executive functioning is just one part of the cognitive areas that we want to look into, and I just wanted to show you a little table, which just includes some areas that our tests will control for, and some areas that we'll be examining as part of the research study. Okay, so the HD-COG study is a research study aimed at investigating the cognitive and behavioural changes that take place in Huntington's disease over time. And just before I get going, I just want to give a big thanks to the Monkstown Hospital Foundation for funding the study, and Beaumont Hospital and the Academic Unit of Neurology for facilitating the study, and also the HDAI for their endless support and help with the HD community. So basically, how can this research study help you and your family? So this study is being carried out in order to increase our understanding of the cognitive and behavioural changes seen in HD, and to gain an insight into the lived experience of someone with HD and their families. So by increasing our understanding in this area, it is hoped that this study can help us and you to understand what needs are required for clinical care, and the experiences that you live every day, and those that are at risk of developing HD and their caregivers. So by identifying these early changes in HD, it can support the production of future clinical trials and allow HD families easier participation than in clinical trials earlier in the disease course, before any significant impairment sets in. So therefore, the overall aim of this study is to improve and advance clinical trial design and participation in future trials. So we hope to aid this by getting a greater understanding. Okay, and just to kind of wrap up what we hope to achieve from this study. So this project aims to identify and describe cognitive profile of HD patients in Ireland, and identify the clinical needs of patients and their caregivers. We also are recruiting gene-negative caregivers, to provide us with information about the challenges and burden associated with providing significant care to a family member across multiple generations. We're also hoping to validate a screening tool as a biomarker of cognitive impairment, in particular earlier on in the disease. And this particular screening tool has demonstrated to be effective in other diseases such as motor neuron disease and frontotemporal dementia. And it can detect early cognitive impairments in a range of cognitive functions. It will also be a great help for those who might not be able to participate in lengthy assessments, or if someone has difficulties with speech, they can actually write down the answers. So we want to compare our data to the international data available in the Enroll HD platform to see how the Irish genotype of HD compares to patients in other countries. So we also finally want to investigate the nature of, and investigate successfully, the nature of the burden with caregivers to help them have some care in themselves and support of HD patients. So just a bit about the recruitment side of things now. We are actively recruiting, and we hope to get participants from the Huntington Disease Association of Ireland and advertising in the Department of Psychology and through the Enroll HD Clinic. We hope to have a total of 90, at least 90 participants with 30 in each group. In the pre-manifest, manifest and G-negative equally, we want as many caregivers. So just a bit about the recruitment process. You will be called up just about the study, and with your permission, we will email you an information sheet which you can read through and then make a decision on whether you want to participate or not. We can then email you on the consent form, which is all set up to do online. So the study can either be carried out in the Department of Psychology or through a secure online link. So you'll be asked to complete a series of demographic questionnaires and some questionnaires about your health, mood and well-being. This will all be done on Qualtrics, and then it will all be discussed over the phone. And then one part of the study involves doing some neuropsychological tests, and what this means is just taking a measure of your thinking and behavior. So this will allow you to meet the researcher and have a chat with them, like a brief kind of interview, and then get going with the tests. So the person who, if you have a carer, they will also be asked, with your permission, to complete some questionnaires about their own well-being and about your behaviour, but only obviously if you agree to this. So the online assessments are done through a platform known as Attend Anywhere, which is an approved platform by the HSE to do these online assessments. We will arrange a suitable time that suits your needs, and you can decide whether to do it in person or at home. But obviously, at the moment, just with COVID, we can't bring anyone into the hospital, so we are doing everything online. So we also want to repeat these tests each year for a period of 4 years to get a better understanding of HD as the disease progresses over time. But you can withdraw at any time. It's totally voluntarily, and you don't have to give us a reason, and it won't affect your medical care at all. We'll contact you each year just to see if you want to continue with the participation in the study. Okay, and just lastly, we have several people on. We are actively recruiting and doing the assessments. We have several people on our waiting list who have been contacted already, and some we don't have numbers for. So if you are on our list, if you know that you've contacted us, but we might have your number to give you a call, just email hdresearch@tcd.ie. And I just really want to thank you for your time and consideration to come on to this webinar and participate in the research. And I really look forward to hearing about your experiences, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you, Mairead, for its great overview of HDCOG. And really the purpose of that was to allow us to really drill deep into understanding aspects of thinking and behavior in Huntington's, particularly in early stages. And Colin Pilo, our next speaker, is going to talk to us a little bit more about that and with some of the data that we found, where we're at the current state in relation to these projects, and update in terms of his own PhD research that's going to happen over the coming year. So we'll go straight into Colin.
Hello all, I'm Colin Pilo. I'm a PhD researcher here in Trinity College Dublin, working with Professor Niall Pender and Professor Orla Hardiman. And I work very closely with all of these other lovely people presenting today, but my particular interest is in the neuropsychology of Huntington's disease. And this is basically the study of how Huntington's can affect people's thinking, cognition, and behavior. So thanks everyone for logging on. It's great to get the opportunity to introduce myself and chat to you today. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and answering some of your questions about HD or the HD research in Ireland. I think events like this are really important for you to see what work is being done by us and for us to get your feedback so that our research and the needs of the HD community align and is of benefit to you. But before I dive into my research, I wanted to introduce myself, tell you briefly about my path to working in the area of Huntington's disease. So after studying in psychology in Maynooth University, I went to Queen Square in University College London, and I did a master's in clinical neuroscience. And it was in UCL where I was first really introduced to Huntington's disease. And while I was here, I did a project with Professor Ed Wild, who many of you might know. And this was looking at biomarkers in Huntington's disease. And biomarkers is basically a fancy word for measurable signals of disease in the body. And I'll mention these again in a little bit. But in both of my degrees, I was really drawn to the intersection of biology and psychology. And so since my master's, I've worked in psychology and neurorehabilitation services, helping people with brain injuries and mental health issues. And I was very lucky to have the opportunity to work on this team in Trinity College and Beaumont Hospital, who have lots of experience in motor neuron disease research in particular. And all of this led me to where I am now, looking at how changes in the brain due to illness, like Huntington's disease and motor neuron disease, affects people's cognition and behavior. And so Emily and Mairead have introduced some of the main projects we have ongoing in HD at the moment and what participating in those looks like. But now I want to reinforce the reasons why neuropsychology is important in this picture and tell you a little bit more about my particular interests in and what I hope to achieve over the next 4 years of my PhD alongside the HD cognition study. To refresh a bit of background, as you probably know, in people with the HD gene, a buildup of the faulty Huntington protein causes cells in the movement centers deep in the brain to die. And these changes are what cause the movement symptoms of Huntington's. But these centers also connect via complex networks to areas involved in higher level thinking or cognition in the frontal lobes. And so as these brain networks begin to be interrupted in HD, personality changes and difficulty with certain cognitive functions can become noticeable by the person themselves or the people that know them well. And the words cognitive and cognition have been mentioned a bit today, and just so everyone's aware what we mean by this, cognition is essentially thinking ability, or the mental processes that help us gain knowledge and understand the world. And so the changes that we see in HD sometimes include difficulty paying attention, multitasking, processing information, and also difficulty recognizing emotion. And these symptoms sometimes start to happen even before diagnosis, before the motor symptoms are present, but this doesn't happen in everyone. And even though there's one gene that causes Huntington's, the specific types of thinking changes aren't very well understood. And some people have different symptoms or develop them at different times, and we're not really sure why this is. And so to examine this, we need to go deep and do what's called deep phenotyping, which is essentially looking very closely at different aspects of cognition, behavior, and movement to see if we can find patterns or clusters of patients with similarities. And I'm interested in doing this using neuropsychological assessment, which measures people's cognition and behavior as part of the HD cognition study. And finding these clusters will help us figure out if there are other genes or environmental factors influencing the different patterns, like what symptoms people get and when. And Dr. Sarah Darcy is going to speak a bit more about this after me, about the genetics of HD and the subtle differences, something called genetic modifiers. But I want to focus on the importance of finding these cognitive group differences and similarities. And it's very important to do this for two reasons. Firstly, as you know, there are lots of clinical drug trials going on to find an effective treatment for HD. And Sarah will also talk about these in a minute. And like Emily and Mairead have said, a lot of the research that we do is to be able to design better clinical trials. And this will improve access for Irish patients to clinical trials when they come, hopefully in the not so distant future. And so it's important that we develop tests which can track key thinking changes from as early as possible in clinical drug trials to make sure the treatments that are developed don't just treat the motor symptoms, but also the thinking and behavior changes that can happen, especially if people might have different symptoms and progress in different ways. And these key tests track what are called cognitive biomarkers, specific patterns or signs related to thinking, which are affected in Huntington's. And I'll mention these again in a second. And I'm sure you're all aware of the devastating news of the trials being recently discontinued. And while this now feels very deflating, the fight to find an effective treatment continues. But secondly, considering this and given the impact that cognitive and behavior change can have on the lives of people with HD and the people around them, it's very important that we understand what is typical in HD population in Ireland by using this deep phenotyping method. It's important to understand more about these symptoms and how they progress over time so we can predict what might lie ahead to help patients and their families prepare and better manage cognitive and behavioral change. And we want to understand more about these challenging symptoms and how they might impact with other people around the patient. So instead of these symptoms increasing care strain and decreasing well-being, we want to help families better understand the symptoms and learn what supports we can put in place. With better understanding, preparation and supports, we can reduce care burden and improve well-being. And so biomarkers have been mentioned a couple of times, and there are lots of different types of biomarkers, but they're all essentially measurable signs of disease which can be tracked as a disease progresses, and which can be used to measure the outcome of a treatment to see if it's effective, as I mentioned. So cognitive biomarkers are objective measures of cognitive functioning, like how quickly someone can integrate and process information or recognize complex social information. And these are identified through thinking tests, as are done in the HD cognition study. And the earlier we can reliably track these signs or biomarkers, the better the outcomes can be for patients who have the disease. And the current rating scales aren't particularly sensitive before the motor symptoms start. And so we want to try push this back to be able to identify clinical markers and signs which have real world benefits to patients and which will allow the effectiveness of new treatments be evaluated earlier in the disease process. And it's very important that we have a sensitive and specific tools for assessing cognition early on in HD. And it's why I'm particularly interested in the cognition of people who are pre-manifest or at risk of developing HD, to look for these clusters and patterns which can help identify better, earlier cognitive biomarkers. And in a few minutes, Sarah's going to talk about the different potential biomarker in neurological soft science. And a little after that, Roisin in terms of measuring the electrical signals of the brain. And while the neuropsychology team and I are most interested in cognitive biomarkers, it's important to combine these disciplines for the best possible picture. And it's why we're so lucky to have such a great team spanning these different disciplines, all working towards a common goal. And this type of research is new in Ireland. And so we have a lot to learn and a lot to benefit from. This group in particular has great experience in working with motor neuron disease, and we want to apply this and use it to understand the unique impact and picture of HD in Ireland. And we, of course, have very experienced people who know a lot about Huntington's disease leading the group. And you might have seen this article in the Irish Times recently by our very own Professor Pender. And there are thousands of people affected by HD in Ireland, with or without the gene. And we're committed to understanding HD and how it affects all of you. And we also want to promote more awareness for HD, complementing the great work that the HDAI do. And here I am next to President Higgins, supporting the recent Family Matters campaign on their website. And so we're in good company on this front. But Family Matters is an incredible campaign hosted by the HD Associations of the UK and Ireland, which asks for your experience of HD to give us in the advocacy and research communities some valuable insights into the lives of people touched by HD, as well as providing some really lovely messages from patients and family members affected by HD, and raise awareness for HD outside of the HD community. And this is still running, so I'd encourage you to check out the Living History wall on the website if you haven't already. But through a survey that they ran, they found that 9 out of 10 HD family members reported low awareness for HD in the general population and felt it was underrepresented relative to other similar diseases. He too showed us that people with Huntington's are often most concerned for the well-being and relationships that they have with their family members and how their diagnosis would impact them, often more than themselves. And almost everyone noted the impact of HD on a person's emotional well-being, with 9 out of 10 people who had the gene feeling that this was the case even before they developed symptoms. So Emily and Mairead both spoke about how Enroll HD and HD Cog will help understand and learn more about the lived experience of HD patients and how HD affects caregivers. And we have a brand new member of staff, Ailish Conroy, who will be helping us explore the caregiver experience in more depth to learn more about how best to support those of you in that position. HD is an incredibly difficult disease to navigate because of its impact on the whole family, gene or no gene. And unfortunately, awareness is relatively low. But campaigns like this one are so important to raise awareness, help orient us to understand the experiences and symptoms that you have, and learn how best to support HD families and what you in the HD community most need. And our own research understanding the needs of people with HD will provide scientific backing to advocate for better services and better supports. So I'd really encourage you to continue participating in campaigns like this and fighting for your voice to be heard alongside ours. And you'll have the opportunity today to ask us questions and highlight some unexplored areas that you think are important to explore in research. And you just have to let us know in the Q&A function below. So just a quick recap. The goals of our research on the HD research team is to understand more about the cognitive and behavioral changes that are seen in HD, to support clinical trials, to help individuals and their carers understand their symptoms, and to put supports in place to help manage them. And we're doing this by using deep phenotyping to identify clusters of symptoms and robust cognitive biomarkers. And the reason we do what we do is to help people affected by this terrible disease. But we need your help to do this, both to participate in research and to feedback on what's important to you. And you can participate in any amount of research that you feel happy to. Again, whether you have the gene or not, from an online questionnaire to participating in all of the research projects, because they all complement each other. But that's it from me. Thank you again for attending, and to Patricia and the HDAI for collaborating on this event and for all the work they do generally. But don't forget to pop your questions and comments in the Q&A section for us to respond to at the end, or get in touch through the email address down the bottom as well. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions.
Thank you, Colin. That's a great summary of the research and the importance of the research within the HD community, and the value that we have in terms of trying to make sure that the research that we're doing fits within the community and fits with the needs of the community in Huntington's disease, as well as expanding the research that we know needs to be done. So that's an excellent summary of that work, and hopefully you're all getting to see the way in which all these studies start to hang together to be able to unravel the story and teach us a bit more about Huntington's disease. So I'm going to move you all along. It's a very rapid collection of talks this morning. So the next speaker is going to be Dr. Sarah Darcy, who's going to talk to us about her PhD research in neurology of Huntington's disease. Thank you, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. We all appreciate having you here and having the opportunity to engage with you as people directly affected by HD and by the work that we're doing. So it's really important for us to have sessions like these so we can design and carry out research in a way that is meaningful to you and to the HD community at large. So I'm going to give a brief presentation today around current genetic research and talk about some of the aspects of early HD that I'm interested in. So just a brief introduction about me. My name is Sarah Darcy and I'm a medical doctor, was previously working as a neurology registrar in the clinical setting before deciding to undertake research work. So I'm mainly interested in so-called neurodegenerative diseases, of which HD is one. I'm in the first year of my PhD at the moment with Professor Hardiman and Professor Pender here between Beaumont Hospital and Trinity College, Dublin. So it's a really exciting time for HD at the moment, and there's a real appetite and a push to drive research forward towards finding an effective treatment. And today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the current landscape of genetic research in HD, with a brief run through of current trials that are using gene-based treatments in humans. I'm also going to talk about our own research goals and why we are interested in pre-manifest or early HD. And lastly, I'm going to introduce the concept of neurological soft signs and why they're of interest in our research. So let's talk a little bit about genetics and HD for a second. So genes are obviously sections of our DNA that contain codes that the cells in our body can interpret and use to make proteins. And these proteins can then perform countless jobs in our bodies, and really they make us who we are. And as you know, in HD, the Huntington gene contains faulty code in the form of a stretched out section called a CAG repeat. And that means that a faulty version of the Huntington protein is made, and then that this leads to symptoms of Huntington's disease. So we've known this for decades, but we haven't had the technology to intervene at a genetic level until relatively recently. So gene-based trials for HD are really focused on getting rid of that abnormal Huntington protein, but they have to be careful at the same time not to get rid of the normal Huntington protein in the process, which we know we also need in order to live. So it's a balancing act between getting rid of the harmful protein and then keeping the helpful one. So one way of stopping the abnormal Huntington protein from being made is by using something called an antisense oligonucleotide, or an ASO for short. So this is a kind of a specially designed molecule that garbles the information between the Huntington gene and the protein building machinery in your body, so that the abnormal Huntington protein just isn't made. It's something that's working in other brain diseases, and the science behind the idea is extremely robust. So these medications are delivered by injection, which are given into the lower back, into the fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. Unfortunately, 2 trials using ASOs in HD were recently discontinued. Those were the Precision HD trial run by Wave Life Sciences and the Tominersen trial, or the Generation HD trial from Roche and Ionis. So this is disappointing, but it also provides information on how to move forward with new approaches using ASOs, which is something the companies behind both trials are planning to do. So Wave are already planning a new trial with a modified version of the ASO molecule that has been developed by them. So there's still hope on the horizon for ASOs. AMT 130 then is a gene therapy in a kind of a more traditional sense, in that it's only delivered once as a permanent treatment and it can't be reversed. So it's actually delivered surgically directly to the brain, and it aims to reduce the level of Huntington protein again. And that trial is in its early stages, but so far there haven't been any safety concerns, so that's great. And there's also interest then in some oral therapies or pill-based treatments for HD. So one is a new drug that has been developed and it's in its very early trial stages. And another involves repurposing a drug that's already used to lower abnormal proteins in another brain disease called SMA, or spinal muscular atrophy. So we don't know much about those approaches yet, but it's definitely a space to watch. So when we think about where gene therapy is headed in the future, or where it could go, we might think about directly targeting the abnormal Huntington protein production at the highest level or the earliest level. In other words, directly targeting the abnormal code in the DNA. So this kind of approach is still very much in the laboratory phase. It's extremely challenging to deliver, but it's potentially on the table for HD in the future. Another approach then would be to target other genes that actually affect how the Huntington gene works in the body. So these genes are called modifier genes because they can modify, for example, the way 2 different people with the exact same gene and the exact same expansion actually express that gene on an individual level. And we know that most genes don't work alone. They're affected by lots of other biological processes in the body at lots of different points along the journey from that initial code in the DNA to the eventual effect. So we already know of quite a few modifier genes in HD that affect the function of the Huntington protein. It might be the reason that, for example, we can have 2 people with the same abnormal HD gene, the same number of CAG repeats, as I said, but very different disease patterns. So going forward, we also want to see people with HD enrolled in clinical trials earlier, so before they have obvious HD symptoms. And this is because by the time people with HD are enrolled in trials and are very symptomatic, the damage is already done, so to speak, and the disease process is not being slowed or halted early enough. So this is thought to be one of the reasons that the trials using ASOs haven't been successful so far. So one of the issues with enrolling people with HD to trials before they have obvious problems with their thinking or their movement, etc., is that the people running the trials don't have really good ways to know if the drug is working. So they can check to see if the Huntington protein levels go down, but they don't know if that's actually having a clinical effect. So what we really want to do is to meet and examine people who come from HD families, who have the HD gene, but not any obvious signs of disease, and look carefully for signs that might not be so obvious. So this will help us firstly to get a better insight into what those very early subtle stages of HD look like. And then secondly, it will help us to recruit people earlier to trials. So we would like to be able to connect the clinical information that we get with the genetic information that comes out as well. So for example, it's possible that some modifier genes that I was talking about earlier leave subtle clinical traces that we might be able to pick up. If we can do this, it'll help us to piece together and unpack what these genes are actually doing in the body. And if we can do that, then we have a better idea of how to target them with gene-based therapies. So these kind of detailed, subtle, early clinical markers are really important to us for those reasons. And when I say clinical markers, there are lots of different kinds. So from what Colm has been talking about with psychological and cognitive markers to what Roisin is going to be speaking about next around the electrical signals in the brain. So I'm going to introduce you briefly to one kind of early marker that I'm hoping to look at in pre-manifest HD patients and family members. And these are called neurological soft signs. So neurological soft signs are signs that can be picked up by a clinician on a physical examination of the nervous system. So they relate to subtle problems in coordination, sequencing, sensory problems, and abnormal reflexes, just to name a few. And it's important to know that by themselves, in a healthy person, they don't necessarily point to any disease process. We find them normally in about 5% of the general population. So having them doesn't necessarily mean that something worrying is going on. They don't point to, for example, any specific spot in the brain or nervous system that's having a problem. However, even though they're generally benign findings, we do see them more in people who have an underlying brain disease. So for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and some dementias. So they might also be more common in family members of people with those brain diseases, meaning that they're relevant then to the genetic makeup of those families. And we think that neurological soft signs will probably be present with a higher frequency in people with HD, who have the HD gene and who are pre-manifest or who don't have any obvious symptoms. So they might be more common as well in their unaffected family members, as we've seen in other brain diseases. If this is the case, and if we can show it, then we can connect it with the other information we have in terms of neuropsychology, EEG, and imaging, and try to understand this pre-manifest profile of HD in a more thorough way, and to connect that profile then to the genetic information that we have. So in conclusion, I would say that we're certainly in a very exciting time for HD research, and there's a lot of promise in gene-based therapies, especially as we've seen them work so well in other brain diseases. So we know it can be done, it's just a matter of getting it right for HD. What we definitely need going forward is to recruit people with the HD gene to trials much earlier so we can get ahead of the disease. In order to do this, then we need markers of the disease like neurological soft signs that I've just spoken about. And these will help us then hopefully to better characterize the beginning stages of HD, to run more effective clinical trials, and to connect that genetic information we have with the clinical information so we can better understand the processes that are actually modifying the function of the HD gene in different people. So I want to thank you all so much for listening to this presentation, and also just want to thank the HDAI for all of their ongoing support with this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was an excellent summary, a very complex area. I really appreciate that. And continuing the multidisciplinary theme of our research and the value and importance of multidisciplinary research in Huntington's, we're going to come to our final recorded talk this morning. It's from Dr. Roisin McMacken, who's a postdoctoral researcher in neurophysiology, that's EEG, and other techniques such as TMS, and she's going to discuss these in her research in Huntington's and motor neuron disease. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Roisin McMacken and I work at the Academic Unit of Neurology in Trinity College. And for this segment of the webinar, I'll be describing some new research that we're starting, looking at changes in brain networks in Huntington's disease using TMS. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what's involved and what TMS is and the reasons that we're doing this research. So as a brief introduction to why I'm undertaking this research in Huntington's disease, I recently completed a PhD in clinical medicine with Professor Pender and Professor Hardiman, looking at if brain function tests could predict how motor neuron disease would affect each individual in terms of changes in movement, in changes of cognition, and in changes of behavior, because it's quite an unpredictable disease in terms of how it affects each individual. And this has been showing a lot of success. So not only are we continuing this research in MND and trying to expand it towards clinically applicable tools, but we're also interested in seeing if this approach would be successful in other diseases. And Huntington's disease, as we know, is another disease which unpredictably affects movement and cognition and behavior. So we're hoping it will also be useful to the Huntington's disease community. So the reason we want to look at these brain function tests is that while we know the effects of Huntington's disease are primarily seen in the basal ganglia, which is this deep structure in the brain, the basal ganglia has its effects via connections to other areas of the brain. So these strands, these multicolored strands you can see on this picture here, are a map of the connections between different areas of the brain, between the signaling cells or neurons which generate the brain functions. And you can see that the basal ganglia has very rich connections to areas at the front of the brain involved in cognition, as well as to areas at the top of the brain which are involved in generating movement. And while the basal ganglia is often studied in Huntington's disease, we need to know a lot more about how each individual is affected in terms of these connections, because it is these connections that are fundamental for generating movement and cognition and behavior, and therefore which may be responsible for the breakdown of the normal performance in these aspects in those with Huntington's disease. So what we want to know is, first of all, what way does Huntington's disease affect these connections between the movement and cognition and behavior controlling areas, so that we can better understand the disease and therefore make a more informed approach towards developing therapies. We also want to know how the changes in these connections relate to the symptoms that each individual experiences, so that we can predict how each individual may be affected in terms of movement and cognitive and behavioral changes. And we also want to know how early does Huntington's disease affect these connections, because we know from other diseases that it's very likely that these connections are affected much earlier than the symptoms begin. And the earlier we can measure these changes, the earlier we can measure if a therapy is working or not on the basis of these measures. And also the earlier we can predict if an individual can expect certain types of symptoms and certain severities of those symptoms. So we have a number of different tools available to look at changes in brain connections, and one of these is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So it sounds a bit scary, but it's really not. There's no invasive procedures involved, so there's no needles or no blood or anything like that. It's using magnets, so we're not using electricity, so there's no electric shocks or static involved. And all the participant has to do is relax in a chair. So you can see on this image in the center of the slide, here, this individual with the red and white cap on is just sitting down relaxing, and they have some sticky pads on their fingers. This gentleman here applies the magnetic pulses through this white coil, and the magnetic pulses can engage certain circuits in the brain, which ultimately leads to the activation of the movement controlling cells. And they then send a signal down the spinal cord via the motor neurons to the target muscle, in this case the hand, and then the hand gives a little twitch. And this is barely noticeable to most individuals. But by recording how the pulses applied to the head affect this contraction in the muscle, we can measure not only the movement controlling centers, but also how the behavior and cognition controlling centers are abnormally or normally functioning in each individual. So it's quite an easygoing study to partake in. It might be a little bit boring. It takes maybe about 2.5 hours to take part in, but we generally have quite a positive reception to taking part, because, as I said, there's no needles or no shocks involved. I would like to point out that we're not using repetitive TMS or TMS, because if you Google TMS, you might get some information about OR-TMS, which is a related but different procedure that has been investigated as a therapeutic for certain diseases. And I just want to make sure that it's clear that we're not, this is not a trial for this repetitive TMS. This is an investigational study. So for this study, we're looking for volunteers who have been diagnosed with Huntington's disease or family members of those diagnosed with Huntington's disease. You can be related or unrelated, and your genetic status can be known or unknown. That's not an issue for taking part. We're looking for anyone 18 years of age or older, so there's no upper age limit, you just need to be an adult. And the sessions take place in St. James's Hospital in Dublin in a dedicated research facility. This is 5 minutes from Euston Station, or you can easily get to the hospital from the Lewis line. And these sessions take about 2.5 hours, which we do Mondays to Fridays, 9 AM to 4 PM. So we can find a time to suit you best. So if you'd like to register your interest, we will be providing information at the end of the webinar on how you can give your details or ask any questions if you're interested in taking part. So thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing from anybody if you're interested or have any questions.
Thanks so much, Roisin. That was great, and it's really lovely to see such exciting new research in Huntington's disease, looking at different modalities and different techniques. And I'd also like to thank all our speakers this morning. They put a great deal of work into preparing their presentations and sharing their research and ideas with you, and are looking forward to hearing your own thoughts and feedback from the HD community as to whether this is research that you find valuable and useful and feel it would be helpful overall moving Huntington's disease research forward. So lastly, we're going to turn to our live speaker. As I mentioned at the start, our final speaker probably doesn't need that much introduction to anybody here, but Professor Orla Hardiman. She is a consultant neurologist in Beaumont Hospital, professor of neurology and head of the academic unit of neurology in Trinity College Dublin. She's also the clinical lead for neurology. And has been instrumental in setting up the multidisciplinary clinics and leading M&D clinics in Ireland. And we're now applying a similar model to the Huntington's disease clinic. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Hardiman to finish off our talk this morning before we begin the panel discussion.
So I don't have any slides. But I thought we might just paint a picture of where we think we're going with respect to the management of neurological conditions in Ireland, and particularly with reference to Huntington's. So, as you know, my background, I'm a clinical neurologist. I was the 11th neurologist appointed in the country. I've been around a long time, so obviously neurology has grown, and the number of neurologists has grown in the country. And now we have about 10 neurological centres in the country, and we work really closely with the Neurological Alliance, of which the Huntington's Disease Association is a member. We're very well aware within neurology that we're underserving a very large proportion of our co-citizens in the country, and Huntington's disease is one of those. And if we think about how we should develop neurological services in Ireland, what we've been trying to do is think about areas where we have been successful and use those as models of how we might deliver services going forward. So the sort of broad construct of what we want to do is to have a good neurological service across the country for everybody with a neurological problem. So everybody should be able to access a neurological hub within a geographic area that's not too far away from where they live. And that should work really well, particularly for people with relatively common neurological disorders. And we should be able to, along the lines of what Sláintecare wants to do, make sure that people get care, their neurological care, as close to the community as they can. So that model works really well for things like epilepsy and migraine. Then we have conditions where they're not quite as common as epilepsy and migraine, but they're still relatively common, and people should be able to access neurological care fairly regularly, and that care should be primarily delivered in centres where people know what they're talking about. In other words, centres where there's neurology. So those would be things like MS and Parkinson's disease. But there are conditions, and Huntington's is one of them, where really tertiary care in a single centre of excellence, but maybe with linkages to other centres around the country, is the ideal approach. And the model that we have there that works very well is the motor neuron disease model. And we've just been funded this year by the HSE to support the multidisciplinary model of care for motor neuron disease to the specialist clinic in Beaumont, where we have a full complement now of the multidisciplinary team. And the model is to ensure that the care is provided in the centre as excellence, but working really closely with the voluntary organisation and allowing us to integrate the care between the hospital and the community. So people can come to the hospital, they receive expert advice from all of the members of the team that have that expertise. So it's not just doctors, it's all the members of the team. And you can see that from the panel this morning, working closely with the voluntary organisation. And of course, for motor neuron disease, the issues around a rapidly progressive condition, and people have physical decline, but they also have cognitive and behavioural decline. And unfortunately, people have a short life expectancy. So the model for motor neuron disease is linking closely with the multidisciplinary team, but also with palliative care, and moving back and forth with palliative care services, and ultimately moving into the community with palliative care support structures and services. So that model is well defined, and we costed it, and it's now, as I said, funded. For conditions like Huntington's disease, we can use that as a model. The types of specialists that we need are a little bit different, of course. So for Huntington's disease, integration with knowledgeable psychiatrists who really understand the disease and understand all of the barriers towards care and the limitations of current services and the types of interventions that are needed, that's going to be required. So we've a bit of building to do to ensure that we can deliver a high quality program of care for people with Huntington's. And as came across this morning, this is really important, because even though the clinical trials that have been reported on in the last few months have been negative, there's a huge interest within the pharmaceutical industry in conditions like Huntington's disease. They're seen now as diseases that are worthy of investment and for which the probability is high of being able to identify treatments that are going to work. So there will be a pipeline or a growth of new potential drugs. And one of the things that we need to do in Ireland is make sure that we have people that we know about across the country who would be suitable for the clinical trials, and that we can enroll really quickly. And the way you do that is by doing the things that are happening now, like Enroll HD, also developing a register. So to some extent, Enroll HD has some of the aspects of register, but really working very hard to try and identify everybody in the country who has Huntington's. And we've done this really effectively for motor neuron disease. So the motor neuron disease register has been running for 25 years, and it's the longest running register in the country, in the world rather, the longest running register of its kind for motor neuron disease in the world. And we now have our pick of clinical trials for motor neuron disease, even though we're a small country, and even though the numbers of people with motor neuron disease now are relatively small, we have been able to show that we can enroll people really quickly into clinical trials, and we have a clinical trial unit now. So that's been a work that took a long time to put together, but I think that, it's a good place to start now for the diseases. So if we have knowledge of everybody in the country who has the disease, and we know where people are who have the disease, and we know that they're interested in clinical trials, running this concurrently with building register and trying to develop the Huntington's disease services, I think will be the way that we'll be able to get people into trials much earlier. And actually our register, Colin Pilo is a man of many talents, as I think was apparent today, but he's been helping us with the motor neuron disease register for the last year. So he has a lot of expertise, along with his boss, Mark Heverin, who's our research manager in Trinity. So we have the expertise to do this. So I think the next 2 to 3 years we're going to be busy, because what we need to start doing is generating the evidence to build the business cases to ensure that we can drive the services for Huntington's disease forward in an evidence-based way that's beneficial, but that also makes sense to the health service executive, that we can show that it's good for patients, good for quality of life, good for outcomes. We know this from the motor neuron disease clinic. If people attend our clinic, they live longer, they have better quality of life, they have better outcomes. It's cheaper in the long term to do it. So we've loads of data to show that. We've started because some of the resourcing that we've got from the HSE this year to support the motor neuron disease clinic, we've suggested that some of the administrative support that we've got for the clinic, that we will use that to try and build the groundwork for the administration of a multidisciplinary clinic for Huntington's. In Ireland, a lot of what we should be doing within the health service is actually done by the voluntary sector, and it's a very significant contributor to the development of quality of care, and to bridge the gap between what the HSE provides and what the person with the condition really needs. And Huntington's Disease Association of Ireland is a really good example of an organisation that really does bridge that gap. And as we build the services, it's very important that we incorporate in the value and the role that HDAI provides for people with this condition. When I started first in neurology back in the mid-90s, there was an antipathy towards recognising the role that the voluntary sector plays in the delivery of care. I'm pleased to say that that's changed now, and with the development in 1999 originally with the Neurological Alliance, which is now over 22 years old now, and the advocacy that the NAI has provided, and also the demonstration that we've been able to undertake of the really strong added value of incorporating or the voluntary organisation into the delivery of care, and in some instances even having members of the voluntary organisation within the clinic. So, for example, in the motor neuron disease clinic, we have the nurses who provide care to the IMNGA sit in the clinic with us. And when I ran the MS clinic in Beaumont, we had the same thing, and the Migraine Association also provided support in the migraine clinic and muscular dystrophy and the muscular dystrophy clinic. So recognising the value and incorporating that into the business plan of the voluntary organisation is really important. And I think that's something we will be doing over the next year or two as we build the case to roll out a national multidisciplinary service for this rare disease along the model that we've had, that we've used successfully for motor neuron disease. So I'm going to close there, Niall, because I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say, unless anybody wants to raise any questions or comments about what I've just talked about.
Thank you, Orla. That's absolutely perfect. Thank you. We have a few questions coming.